This week I restored a 100-year-old Jacobian hutch. Isn't it beautiful? The wood overlay on the door was broken, and there were multiple scratches and dings throughout. I think it had 100 years worth of dirt on it because, as you'll see, it was filthy. In this video I'm going to show you how I restored it without stripping and with only minimal sanding. You'll see how my DIY chalk paint recipe provided the finishing touches to respectfully bring it into the 21st century. Initially, I used Crud Cutter to clean this hutch. It's my go-to cleaner for most furniture restorations, yet I know there are times when Crud Cutter just won't do the job, and this was one of those times. As you can see, it's just moving the dirt around. You can see on the left, after I cleaned it 2 times with Crud Cutter, there's still a haze on the finish. That's dirt. This is what it looked like after I cleaned it just once with TSP and then rinsed it with water. Isn't that amazing? I used TSP to clean the entire hutch and rinsed it well. TSP really did a great job with minimal effort on my part. I unscrewed the knobs and then carefully removed the nails holding them in place. The splines holding the glass and wood overlay were pried off and then labeled so I could replace them later in the same location. I now turn my attention to the legs and feet that I had cleaned the day before. They were now thoroughly dry. The finish looked dull and there were a few nicks, but overall it looked to be in pretty good shape. It didn't appear that any sanding was needed because the finish was smooth to the touch. Since the finish was in pretty good shape, I just wanted to restore it instead of stripping it and starting all over. Restoring it would be a lot less work and take less time. The nicks exposed the wood, so I wanted to use something to restain these areas. Since the hutch was made around 1910, I knew that polyurethane was not used on it. It wasn't invented yet. I had used Varathane stain with polyurethane very successfully to fill in nicks on the dining room set that I flipped recently, and it worked perfectly. It too was not finished with poly. That video will be linked at the end of this video. So I thought I would give it a try using the poly stain on these claw feet. I figured it couldn't hurt. The worst thing that would happen is I'd totally mess up the finish and I'd have to strip it all and restain it, which was the only option I had if this poly stain didn't work, since I didn't want to paint the legs and feet. So I took a very fine steel wool pad and dipped it in the poly stain and dabbed it on one claw foot as a test. It was actually one of the least damaged feet. I rubbed it in with the steel wool and later wiped off the bits of steel wool that had come off. It did a fairly good job of filling in the exposed areas and it did pretty closely match the existing dark stained areas on the feet. I later found out that a sponge worked much better at applying it because I found that I did not need to wipe it off. I feathered the poly stain into the surrounding areas and only applied this poly dark stain to the dark areas of the legs and feet that were damaged. I did not cover the entire area. I just used it for specific areas. The next day, when the poly stain was completely dry, I reapplied a little more stain to any area that still showed a little raw wood peeking through. Over the course of the next 3 days, I went back to these areas and reapplied the poly stain as needed until the areas were completely filled in with stain and the worn or damaged areas were no longer apparent. Do you want even more tips, before and afters, and a look behind the scenes? Follow me on Instagram at Furniture Flipping for Profit. I had used Howard's Restor Finish in the past with no success because it really did little to repair scrapes and scratches in the wood. Since these legs and feet looked like they just needed some moisture to bring them back to life, I thought I would give it another try. I had already tried to use Howard's Dark Walnut on the damaged areas on the feet, and it didn't cover the scratches and dings well enough. The lighter areas of this base were more of a golden oak color and didn't appear to be scratched up, so I thought the Howards just might work. I waited until all of the areas that I had restored with the poly stain were completely dry before I applied any Howards. I was a little concerned that the Howards would reactivate the poly stain, and I was happy to see that that did not happen. The poly stain stayed put. I first used an artist brush to apply it in the carved areas and any area that would be difficult to reach. I then used a superfine steel wool pad to apply the Howard's Golden Oak to the rest of the legs and feet. I used the dark walnut Howards specifically on the areas that were stained dark. The wood just soaked it up and began to glow with new life. You can see the dramatic difference in these two images. I wiped off the Restor Finish within a few minutes after application per the manufacturer's instructions. With the legs and the feet finished, I now turned my attention to the cabinet. There were several areas where the finish was scratched down to the bare wood, leaving a mark in the wood. Had I just painted over this area, the scratches would have been seen in the final finish. Therefore, I used 220 grit sandpaper to sand these areas. Since the bare wood was now exposed in these areas, they were now susceptible to bleed through. Bleed through is where the tannins and stain bleed through to the final finish. Bleed through can ruin your finish. An oil-based primer can prevent bleed through, but I wasn't going to use primer on this hutch. Therefore, I sprayed these areas that had the exposed wood with shellac to prevent bleed through from occurring. I planned to distress this piece after painting, and had I used primer, the color of the primer would have been exposed when I distressed it. I removed the door and brass hinges so I could polish them later. The inside of the hutch was in good shape. I tried for about an hour to take the shelves out, but I found no way to remove them, so I left them in place and cleaned them with crud cutter and then rinsed them with water. When they were dry, I applied dark walnut Howard's Restore It to the shelves and interior with a steel wool pad. After a short time, the excess was wiped off with a clean dry cloth. The shelves looked great. I planned to use some bare chalk paint that I'd left over from a prior makeover in the color Jean Jacket Blue, but when I painted it on the side, I thought the color was extremely too light. I had a gallon of Oops paint that was Bare Premium Plus paint and primer in flat. That was a dusty blue color in my inventory, so I pulled it out and added calcium carbonate to make chalk paint. My chalk paint recipe will be in the video description. I then tested the second color on the hutch and didn't like that color either because it was too light. I added some black chalk paint and it was still too light. I added even more black chalk paint and finally I liked the color. Since it was custom mixed, I can't give you the exact color, but I have gone to Home Depot and I found a color very similar. The color name and ID number will be in the video description. I used a synthetic bristle brush to apply the paint to the exterior of the body of the hutch. This chalk paint was smooth as silk and covered well. I sanded the entire surface with a brown paper bag or craft paper to make certain I would have a smooth final finish before I put on the second coat. This hutch is over 100 years old and I wanted to respect its age. I did not want it to look like it was brand new or a new antique reproduction. Consequently, I chose to use chalk paint and I planned to seal it with furniture wax so it would have a soft, buttery aged finish. After I had given it 2 coats of paint, I sanded it one more time with a brown paper bag or craft paper that I had crumpled up. Then I lightly distressed it with 250 grit sandpaper. I only sanded it in a few places that wear would normally occur. It's easy to overdo the distressing, so I was really conservative. After distressing, I sanded it with the brown paper bag one last time and then removed the dust with a damp cloth before waxing. If you feel that you've gotten some good information from this video, I would appreciate it if you'd give it a thumbs up. That helps my channel a lot because it tells YouTube that this video is of value and others would benefit too. If you become a subscriber and click the notification bell, you'll be notified when I post my weekly videos. The drawer knobs were almost black, so I cleaned them with a toothbrush and Dawn to get rid of grease from 100 years of being touched. I placed them in a pan with full-strength vinegar and brought it to a boil. Within about 3 minutes, the brass started to brighten. It was beautiful. I then used a super fine steel wool pad to polish them. I found that it worked best if they were still warm, so once they cooled off, I dropped them back in the hot vinegar bath for a few seconds. It did not take much scrubbing at all to get them bright and shiny again. Look at the before and after. What a difference! I polished the hinges as well as the knobs. When I finished, I dusted them off to remove any residue from the steel wool and then sprayed them with clear lacquer to keep them from turning dark again. The glass on the door was carefully cleaned and then reinstalled by replacing the wood splines. I then reinstalled the now shiny brass hinges, and the door was reinstalled on the hutch. The last thing I did was to wax the entire hutch. I used a brush and sometimes a sponge to apply a coat of furniture wax and buffed it as soon after I applied it to remove any remaining wax. The following day I applied a second coat of wax and buffed it off. This wax will have to be reapplied every 6 to 12 months, but I prefer this soft, buttery, vintage-age finish on the hutch that the wax and the chalk paint provided. As we look at the before and after photos, I want to express my sincere appreciation to all my viewers that have become subscribers. I have attained 7,000 subscribers and over 250,000 views. I'm so glad that so many of you have found my humble little channel helpful. I appreciate all of your words of support and compliments you've given me in the video comments. Of course, if you found this video of value, I would be very grateful if you would let YouTube know by giving it a thumbs up. Subscribing and liking a video helps my channel immensely, so I can continue to provide videos like this. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the comments. I always respond to comments, and I enjoy feedback from my viewers. On the right, you'll see several videos that provide additional information about how to refinish, restore, and restyle furniture so you can flip it for a profit or refinish it for your personal use. Thanks for watching.
Saw you from across the room. When our eyes met, I never knew that I could feel this way, and it's kinda strange.